But at Eagle, we feel that we're different because we don't just sell everything under the sun. We're not what I like to call an a la carte vendor. We actually go out there and we do long POCs, lots of testing. And if there's two products in our portfolio that are similar, they have to be a lot different so that they add value in different ways, right? So we take that engineering pretty seriously. We want to be able to talk about the products, architect the products, install the products, and even support the products, right? We value support, simplicity over complexity. And of course, today's topic is just security, but you can't really evaluate any product nowadays with also looking at its security. So let's get to the agenda. So what are we going to focus on today? I'm going to take my camera off first so I can focus. Well, security, right? Well, we've presented quite a few times on security. Adam's done some really cool deep dives. We've done security posture presentations. So we thought we would kind of approach it maybe from a different perspective. And really, we see a couple of problems when we talk about security. The first is that security as a whole is just really overwhelming. There's so many products. There's so much overlap. All of the vendors want to tell you that they are the best line of defense against bad actors. You know, in small and medium business, you know, keeping in mind that there's some pretty large medium businesses out there. There's a lot of staff and money constraints, and the tech evolves so fast that pretty much on a weekly basis, there's something new to examine or to talk about. So we want to kind of simplify, you know, what you should be doing on your security posture journey. We wanted to make it really consumable because we also see that a lot of people struggle to get upper management to understand what to focus on. Right? And then a couple of things we're going to hang on a little bit is the importance of penetration testing and the importance of some sort of behavior focused endpoint client. So let's get rolling here. So if you guys have watched the previous Dream series, you know that Dream's kind of a misnomer. You know, we're not out there building Ferraris. We're building, you know, sensible systems that take into account security, backup and recovery, their performance, their insurance policies lots of times. But what if we actually wanted to build like a Ferrari security operations center? Well, Gartner always has cool names for their widgets. So you're looking at the SOC visibility triad. And what they're trying to show you is what would it take to have nearly complete visibility in your environment. So obviously it would take an endpoint detection response product. On top of that, you would add network detection and response. And then you would have a fairly large SIEM to gather and correlate all that data. So let's even assume you had a 7-figure budget to get all those products. Now you need 5 to 7 full-time security staff to review that data and respond around the clock. And then if you really want to go all out, you're looking at automated incident response, red teaming, threat hunting, deception, right? It gets pretty ominous. And when I was looking this over, I just started laughing. You know, why aren't you more like Gartner? This isn't really a reality for most of our customers. We have customers that are at this level, but they're typically Fortune 500s that are willing to spend a pretty big wad of cash, right, to get to that level. So what I find in reality is that even a lot of our customers that have billions of dollars in revenue, they struggle to keep 3 to 4 security professionals, right? They even can't afford to pull all the stops out. So what if we take a more sensible look at this and just talk about a consumable way to decide how you can improve your security posture? So I used my mediocre Photoshop skills and I took that Gartner triad and tried to break it down, right? So, you know, this is kind of thing you could just print off and put above your desk. And, you know, when you have time to focus on it, this is what you should be doing to stop those bad actors. You need to make it hard for them to get in your environment. You need to make it hard for them to move laterally through your environment. And then, of course, you have to detect intrusions immediately. So we're going to break down those 3 goals and talk about what you can do. And Adam, please don't hesitate to add anything when I stop breathing, which isn't often enough. So security goal number 1, right? You want to make it hard for them to get in your environment. So we've covered a lot of this before in different ways, but it's important to have a sophisticated next-gen firewall. You want to protect against zero-day vulnerabilities and just exploits in general. Ideally, you would have vulnerability scanning. 90% of the attacks come through email. So sophisticated email scanning, you know, Proofpoint, Mimecast, that's an absolute requirement nowadays. You want to keep the email from even tempting the end users, right? Multi-factor authentication is really important. I would say at least for remote users, preferably for domain admin and privileged accounts internally. But we're starting to see insurers not even cover folks unless they have MFA for remote access. And then finally, complex passwords. There are ways, we'll talk about some of them, to grab a hash. You want to make it really hard to crack that hash.
Yep, and I'll chime in here real quick, Brian, on a few of these as well. Just reiterate what Brian's going over and what I've seen in practice, right? So next gen firewall, that's always important. That's, you know, your first line of defense, but it's also really important to have some sort of additional, potentially network log aggregation if you can implement that in your environment. A lot of EDR products now will actually include network traffic filtering or analysis at the endpoint level using kernel drivers or Windows network mini filters that they can install. So when we move on to like frequent security updates, obviously that's going to be the big one, making sure you can get patches pushed to your critical infrastructure. But also just being aware of what's out there and what needs to be patched. Email scanning, these are all really good. If you use Office 365, Exchange Online Protection, EOP is typically built into that, but we see a lot of clients add on something like Proofpoint or something on top of it that just gives them an extra layer of protection. The more clients that use these solutions, the better they are at detecting these new phishing emails and templates that may be sent out. And to touch up on MFA and complex passwords, with MFA, it really is important to avoid push notification MFA if you can. It's super convenient. I've seen a lot of people do it, but there are a lot of bad actors out there who will just continually spam that MFA if they know it's push. And sometimes employees, as they're typically looking at the weakest link and where intrusions come from, sometimes employees may get inundated with those pop-ups and just hit accept on one, and that's all they need for a bad actor to get in. So be aware of that with push notifications. Just make sure your employees are aware of the downsides of push notification if they're getting spammed with them. And for complex passwords, we do recommend at least 15. Service accounts, anything more high privilege, we recommend 30. And that's just simply because, I've been in many engagements where if a password is 8 characters, it's pretty simple to crack with today's GPU power, especially coupled with the word list. Attackers can crack a big list of 8-character passwords in about half an hour and have a pretty good success rate there. So that's really important. And if you're doing any sort of password rotation, it was kind of a popular thing for a while, maybe every 60 days, 90, 120, whatever, you're forcing a password change. Microsoft and NIST actually recommend against doing any sort of password rotation because it can encourage employees to reuse passwords, tag a character on the end of it. And it just kind of generally decreases your overall password security. So just enforcing a really complex policy with a good length and making sure that you don't force a rotation on that too often or at all is ideal. And you can also look at tools to help you frequently scan your Active Directory environment for compromised credentials, which is another thing to dig into. So that's all I had to say on these.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. And it kind of segues into our next point. Most of what you're going to do at your company in the IT security spectrum is blue team, right? You guys are defensive security professionals. So large organizations will have dedicated red team, offensive security groups. How do you get that in the medium-sized business space? Well, you can see one of the bullets there is penetration testing. And of course, that's how Adam thinks, that's what he does. And that's why he adds so much value to these webinars. But when you're looking at protecting that external perimeter, probably the quickest way to get some sort of red team value is to do black box external penetration testing. So this is something that we do at Eagle. Black box means that we don't have any extra knowledge about your environment. So, you know, Adam, please talk over me at any point here, but, you know, Adam essentially is going to act like a bad actor. He's going to use the same tactics, techniques, and procedures known as TTPs as a bad actor. He's going to look at your DNS records. He's going to figure out what other infrastructure you have. He's going to look at dark web data breaches. And he's going to do everything an attacker would do to get through that external crusty shell that you have. Adam, anything you want to add there?
Nope. Yeah, that's exactly right in a nutshell. You know, just coming in with zero prior knowledge, seeing what kind of profile we can build on your employees, what data we can gather on the external internet, really just weaponizing all of that external information to see if there's any sort of way we can get in that external infrastructure. And a big part of that too is with a lot of people on Office 365, we'll take a word list of the most common passwords and common password schemas. You know, for example, say you have the password summer 2022. This sort of schema of like the season, month, and the year is extremely widely used. You would be surprised. And attackers will take these common passwords and spray them against Office 365, potentially gaining access to one of your employees, you know, external 365 accounts. And then from there, they will do things like send phishing emails internally from that compromised user, which have much higher success rates than external, or they may even start dropping malicious payloads on that user's OneDrive that other people within the company might click on, things like that. So that's really an important attack vector to be aware of externally is still that weak password policy. As cliche as it is, and as much as we hear it, it's still probably the biggest thing I see. Even if you have MFA enforced on Office 365, if you don't have other things enabled that prevent different avenues of accessing Office 365 email, the MFA may not come into play. For example, you may be prompted to MFA to log into the 365 login page in a browser, but if you use MAPI to connect directly to the Exchange mailbox, sometimes you can bypass that. There's the EWS OWA API as it applies to Outlook 365. I forget the new name they call it. But different things like that, you know, sometimes allow attackers to get around that MFA. And there's a lot of configuration in Azure and Exchange that you may want to be aware of. But really externally, that's what we're looking at. Every external asset, known vulnerabilities, and then can we password spray and get into anything?
Yeah, and Adam, you're kind of driving my point home, right? A lot of the stuff you said flew over my head, and I couldn't take notes fast enough if I tried. So when Adam and his team does a pen test, they document all this, and they provide mitigation or instructions on how to prevent it. And then they even follow up 90 days later and help you prove that you've closed those holes, right? So once again, a pen tester acting as a red team operator creates a lot of value in these reports. And that's something we'll beat on in a couple of other slides throughout the presentation.
And I can answer a couple of these questions real quick, unless you want to wait till the end, Brian.
No, have at it. I didn't even see them.
Okay. Joseph asked, are you saying we should not require password changes every 90 days? Yeah, both NIST and Microsoft recommend against doing any password rotations. And Microsoft really pushed that idea in 2019. They feel that in general, it just reduces the security and complexity of the password. Even if you have an Active Directory, you can set a password history requirement where AD won't let you reuse the same password up to X amount of times. You know, still, if you have that in play and you're forcing rotation, we often see that employees are just going to append a character at the end, right? Or another number. And these are all things that once you have their old password, you can build upon and brute force, and they generally have good luck with that. So what people are really pushing these days, and what seems to be standard now and recommended, is just to have a very complex password, at least 15 characters for a normal user account, coupled with monitoring or actively checking your Active Directory passwords against known breached or leaked credentials. So that kind of segues into Anderson's question here. What do you recommend for AD-SCAN for password compromises? So there's a lot of software that can do this. I would kind of take a two-phase approach. So first off, make sure you are signed up for Have I Been Pwned if you're not already. You can sign up as an organization and actually set up automated monitoring so that anytime an employee has a leaked or breached credential from a third-party website that's using their work domain, you will get a notification. Then you can be proactive and you can, either inactivate that account, reach out to that employee, or force a password change on their account. So that is really important, but then there are also tools that will look at those passwords in your environment and retroactively compare them against an ever-growing and updating list of compromised passwords. So there's a free solution. If anyone uses KnowBe4 for phishing, you can Google KnowBe4 WPT, weak password testing tool. I believe it's completely free. And you can use that to kind of get an overview of how secure your password policy is in AD and if there's any known or weak passwords within your environment. And then you can move into more paid tools. We could probably send out a list at the end of this to everyone here with some tools that I know some of our clients use. I don't have any strong recommendation either way, but a big one is Inzoic or Active Directory. And I'll just link that at. This isn't really a recommendation, but if you're looking into these type of solutions, this is a popular one that I've seen a few people use. And let me also link that KnowBe4 tool for you guys. Okay, there you go. That's all I had on those two.
Awesome. Did we get all the questions out of the way? Looks like it. All right. Thanks, Adam. That's awesome. So moving on, we still have a lot of customers that don't do any security awareness training with their customers. And I'm sure Adam could speak on this topic for an hour, but Adam doesn't mind weaponizing vulnerabilities or exploits, but as soon as he does, it becomes a cat and mouse game because maybe Defender picks up on it, maybe CrowdStrike picks up on it. Users, it's kind of harsh to say this, they're eternally gullible, right? And it's much easier to phish users. I've seen stats that say it's way over 90–95% of the attack surface in your environment. So security awareness training is really important. There are products out there like KnowBe4 where internally you'll have to manage campaigns. And then we touch on the management component of all types of security products a little bit later. But there are also products that operate on autopilot. So they'll send the weekly or monthly training that's mandatory. Micro learning is a big thing now where they're only a few minutes long, so we keep their attention. They test them with fake phishing attacks, and then they target them, people that fail, for more education. And one thing we're seeing with our larger customers is they are starting to enact real, tangible, serious consequences for repeat offenders. And I've got a couple of tongue-in-cheek examples in there, right? No one's getting jail time yet. But I've used this example in the past. My wife works in IT at a hospital, and if she falls for 2 fake phishing attacks in a calendar year, it actually affects her ability to get a raise. So nobody wants to go home and say, I'm not getting as big of a raise this year because I clicked on 2 stupid phishing emails, right? So enacting some sort of consequence that you're comfortable with at your company can also have a big impact because people are incentivized to take this seriously. Adam, is there anything you want to add on security awareness?
No, that's really good. I always recommend and push for employee training, awareness training, phishing training. KnowBe4 is a really good one if you use Proofpoint. I believe there's an add-on in the Proofpoint package. I don't know that it comes with every package that lets you run phishing simulations and training, but it's getting really difficult these days. I feel like people kind of felt like the Microsoft Word don't enable macro thing kind of fell off. Maybe it's more of a legacy tactic, but we're seeing even more and more methods with Word. There was a recent 0-day out called Felina, which allowed Word to execute PowerShell commands in the background by abusing a URI handler in Windows. So training and awareness is super important. Like we said earlier, attackers are going to first try to send a malicious payload or a phishing link to steal credentials to your employees externally. And if they get the payload to execute, then they're likely going to be on a low privilege endpoint, assuming that's a low privilege user, and they will look, to move laterally within your environment, escalate these permissions, move to more machines. And if they do get credentials, they're just going to target that Office 365 and try to get in the environment that way. Once you're in Office 365, there's a lot of ways you can get in the environment. And one big thing we see is abusing, that user's OneDrive by maybe modifying files in their OneDrive. So when they open them next time on their desktops, it may load a malicious payload. So those are the two things we see. And that's why phishing training and awareness is really important. If you have people working a lot with Word document files, just be aware of who they're exchanging those with externally, and make them be super cautious about receiving those types of files.
That's great,
So
Adam.
I wanted to add a couple things. One thing we've noticed with like Arctic Wolf's managed awareness is they have a gamification option. And so instead of taking the negative approach, it's how do we get people excited to win prizes based on doing all of the phishing campaigns and watching videos and trying to take the positive approach. So there are two ways to do it, and maybe you still have the flogging for somebody that won't even participate in that. But so just something else to think about is there are some positive routes to take as well to try to get people excited to keep learning. And then to your point, the Office 365 and being aware of logins and limiting geo locations on logins and having monitoring of that environment is very key. Because to Adam's point, if they get into Office 365, they can send an email as a known employee to get somebody to open something, or start, manipulating files that are deemed to be good.
Yeah, all good
and that
stuff.
area gets overlooked, right? We focus on endpoints and servers, but.
Well, and you got an excellent point on maybe taking a positive look at reinforcing folks' willingness to train security awareness, right? Yeah, so these are all really good segues to that goal too. So I've seen this quote lots of times. There's two types of companies, right? There's companies that have suffered a breach, and there's companies that don't realize they've suffered a breach, right? So you can do everything you can as it relates to goal one to keep people out of your environment, but you have to make the assumption that someone gets in, and you have to make it really hard to move around. So you notice that we talked quite a bit about moving laterally and privilege escalation. So what are some of the things that you can do to try to prevent that? Well, once again, you see that frequent security updates are important. They're important from keeping people out, and they're important as it relates to keeping people from moving laterally throughout the environment. One of the first things that a bad actor does, or a red team guy like Adam, is they look at Active Directory. We could do a whole presentation on this. There are so many ways to take advantage of older protocols, to use open source tools that are incredibly effective at pointing out group permission inheritance, misconfigurations, loopholes. We still meet lots of folks that use fairly elevated AD accounts to run services on their servers. Through Kerber roasting, those hashes can be taken offline and cracked. So one of the things that a pen tester does, and one of the things that our users should focus on, is Active Directory as well as Microsoft OS hardening. And there are plenty of white papers and solutions. Once again, I'm beating a dead horse, but the advantage of a pen test is this will all get laid out for you with advised mitigations. The days, for instance, of a shared local administrator password are well past us. We still have customers that are doing it though, because they're struggling on what to focus on. And then finally, Adam, you could probably speak to this much better than I could, but Windows Defender ASR rules are a huge help as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll kind of go through these and add a bit to them. So frequent security updates, obviously we talked about that, but that kind of assumes already that you probably have some sort of asset inventory management system in place, right? some way to keep track of all the assets and inventory them on your internal and external networks so you can make sure they are all on the same version, they have the patches applied and things like that. So in order to get to that frequent security update point, sometimes I really recommend you just start with an asset inventory and work from there. And you may already have some software in your environment that can do asset inventory if you already have any sort of security vulnerability scan systems in place, such as Nessus or Rapid7. Those tools can kind of do a good job of building a rudimentary inventory that you can look. They'll also check OS patch levels. You can run scans within those tools with authenticated AD credentials. So they can actually authenticate to every endpoint they're scanning and do some queries on them to find out what software is installed and what versions of software that is. I will drop a link in chat. Again, not a hard recommendation, but if you don't have an asset inventory in place and you're looking for a free solution that I think is pretty solid, you can take a look at Snipe It. It's an open source one. You can look at deploying that if you need to build that. As far as Active Directory hardening goes, the older protocols, there's a lot of blind trust in Active Directory. When you employ AD out of the box, there are a lot of things that are enabled for your convenience, but they can be toyed with and manipulated by attackers. So this is things like LLMNR, a method of resolving IP addresses for short names on the local network. Attackers can spoof that and redirect traffic, steal authentication hashes. And then again, just kind of moving towards disabling NTLM v1 in general. There's a lot of issues with that, but that can be quite the task to bite off. There's a lot of legacy software and hardware that may require that. So sometimes I recommend if you have to use those older protocols for any legacy things in your environment, consider putting all that legacy stuff on its own VLAN or isolating it as much as you can, right? If you have any legacy box, maybe disconnect it from the domain and try working towards migrating that to something updated, because when we move into lateral movement, attackers are going to look to move laterally into another endpoint that is on the domain so they can compromise the credentials, stored passwords, and the secrets of those individuals on that endpoint and just continue to snowball their takeover and get more and more and more. That kind of also bleeds into a lot of users are using browsers. Let's say Chrome's the most popular. Are your employees saving their passwords in Chrome, or are they saving them in another password manager? Because those saved passwords in Chrome can be easily dumped by attackers through some APIs and dumping Chrome's APIs. So that's another thing too we see for credential theft to be aware of. And as far as OS hardening, local administrator password solution is really highly recommended. The goal here is just to make sure that your AD environment is automatically randomizing and rotating the local admin password on every endpoint. You don't have to be aware of what that password is. Set it up, have it rotate that automatically for you every 40 days. And then if you need to see that password to log into that computer, you can view that password with an AD from a privileged account that's in a group that has permissions to view those passwords. So like a domain administrator account. And Windows Defender ASR rules, these are things that are also overlooked. They have to be turned on via GPO or some sort of management software like Microsoft Intune. There's a couple other ways to turn that on, but ASR rules can do things like prevent Microsoft Word from spawning a child process. So when we look at a Word 0 day, right, like Felina, it drops a child process, starts PowerShell, runs a malicious payload. If you had that ASR rule in place, it would have actually, likely prevented an attack like that. So consider looking at those ASR rules if you use Defender and seeing if there's any you can enable and roll out to your environment.
Yeah, and Joseph in the comments had a good point to an earlier topic we were talking about. He himself has seen bad actors taking advantage of appending or sequencing characters to existing passwords, but he made the point that cyber insurance companies are often lagging behind, and they may still have requirements that you have to rotate passwords. And I think I mentioned in a previous presentation, we had a customer that was in a full stop, data centers down, severe breach, and they were told by their cyber insurance they needed 3 bids for incident response before they could move forward. Everyone on the call knows how that's laughable, and it probably costs the company and the insurance company more money. But sometimes you are pigeonholed into doing things that aren't, that are against your best interests, simply because they're not evolving fast enough with their requirements. And to put a bow on this slide, we're flying over a lot of these topics for time, but you just need to harden your environment, right? It has to be really difficult for them to move around. Someone on a workstation should find it very difficult to escalate privileges, to get into your infrastructure. MFA is a huge help here, getting rid of what I like to call the God mode accounts that give you administrative control over multiple parts of your infrastructure. And then, of course, hardening those backups, hardening your snapshots. We do have a hardening engagement that's pretty inexpensive that a lot of people have taken advantage of that helps secure your backup environment as well. All right, and back to pen testing. So Eagle offers pen testing internally. It is approached in a completely different fashion, of course. We call it gray box. The reason that we call it gray box is because, it is a timed engagement. We're going to spend a certain amount of time finding the lowest hanging fruit that you need to mitigate, right? So to that point, you may have something that you were concerned about, and you can let us know about that, and we can modify the engagement. Maybe you have really old infrastructure you want us to look at. Maybe you have a brand new application you want us to look at. But part of the process is finding out what you may be concerned with. And then, in this engagement, we're assuming someone got in your environment, right? And they're sitting on a single, perhaps, workstation. So they're acting as a beacon. So to facilitate that and make that easy, we send out what we call the drop box. It is a Kali Linux Raspberry Pi. It auto homes back to Adam and his team. And from there, they start looking at your environment, pulling your Active Directory, looking at your network structure, and seeing what they can do to move laterally or escalate permissions. Is there anything you want to add here, Adam?
Nope. Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head there. We like to put a box in on that internal network. So in the theme of gray box, you connecting a Dropbox in your environment is an allowance that you give us. And we are also, open and encouraging to providing other allowances, in the sense that we like when customers provide us some guidance. You can completely drop us in on the network totally blind, don't even tell us what subnets to check. And we're going to do our best within that time box engagement to enumerate it like an attacker would. But if you want to make sure and encourage that we get full coverage of your environment, it's always nice to provide some guidance there on the scoping, and we can prioritize that and make sure you get a little more value out of the engagement that way. But the Dropbox is just the way we connect in, and you can also spin that up as a virtual appliance if you would like.
Yeah, and just like the external test, we provide a report, we provide advice on mitigation, and we will optionally test your environment. Is it up to 90 days later, Adam?
Yep, 90 days after the delivery of the report, we can reconnect, have you power that Dropbox back on, and schedule an 8-hour window where we will go through and look at all those high and critical vulnerabilities and try to reproduce them in the report, follow those reproduction steps.
Perfect. All right. So we are at security goal 3 of that triad, detecting immediately. And this is where it kind of gets interesting, in my opinion. So, up at the top is a quote that I could have easily inserted earlier in the presentation, but it's a nice digestible way to explain how this works, right? A typical attack traverses the network. It usually lands in an inbox. And then not only does it attack the endpoint, but it attacks from the endpoint. So attackers use a lot of really sophisticated methods to move laterally and or escalate permissions, but the behavior, the modus operandi, is usually the same. We're going to talk about that next, but where we have seen real damage with our customers is when they don't detect the bad actor in their environment. I've seen plenty of statistics that say the average soak time is well over 6 months. And when you couple that with the sophistication of these organizations now, you can see some really damaging results. They may sit in your environment and slowly exfiltrate data. What we've seen more recently with some of our customers is they will actually observe how people talk to each other. They will figure out who holds the purse strings. They'll figure out who works in procurement. And we've seen as much as $3.5 million that was sent into bank accounts where the money was immediately, vacated, and the customer never got that money back. So, the days of them attacking one workstation and encrypting everything they can are gone, but there's an advantage to that. If they plan to sit there and to gain intel and to move around, right, and escalate permissions, that means if you can detect them in the first minute, hour, day, you have a bit of an advantage because you can isolate them to that machine. You can mitigate the threat. Of course, you still have some post-mortem responsibilities. How did they get in? But you can save yourself from a lot of trouble and a lot of downtime and loss to the business. I'm going to give the smart guy Adam another opportunity. Did I miss anything on that point?
I was going to ask, I think we mentioned honeypots on a slide, right? I may wait till we get there.
Yeah, we talk about we talk about deception from time to time, right? These bad actors don't know your environment, right? So we have customers that will emulate a fifth ESXi host, right, or fake workstations, and that's usually a pretty big tip-off, right? I think we could talk about that now if you'd like.
Yeah, I was just going to say one fun way that's highly effective is if you go in your Active Directory environment and just create a bunch of honeypot accounts. Maybe make a domain admin account that's just that has a common name, right? And set a complex, lengthy, randomized password to it that you store in a secure spot. So an attacker can't actually log into this account, but in the account's description field within AD, put some type of bait like this account's password is summer 2022 or something like that. And you can set up monitoring so that whenever you see an authentication attempt come through your domain controller for a honeypot account, then someone's probably in your environment poking around. It's a way to tip you off and give you a heads up. If anyone tries to authenticate to an account like that, you can set up alerting. And then just honeypotting in general, not even AD specific, dropping those canary tokens, using some of the honeypot features built into the tools you may already have. A lot of EDR products have that. If you're a Commvault customer, ransomware protection drops a lot of honeypot files to the disk that can help you detect when a file's been modified. But what's really interesting about some of these canary tokens is you can generate a file, let's say passwords.xslx, right? Looks like an Excel file of passwords, and just drop that on a file share somewhere. And anytime that file is opened, it's going to ping back to you and you'll get an email and you'll know someone's poking around. So it can be kind of hard to determine maybe if it's externally malicious or an internal employee, but at least you have a heads up there. And you can start digging through logs and seeing if you can correlate any other suspicious activity. So I will post this link in chat for canary tokens. This is the free link. And yeah, you can just generate a lot of different tokens like this that will ping back to you on email. Or you can have them like send a message in your Slack or Microsoft Teams, however you want to set it up. So honeypotting can be really effective for getting a heads up before some of your other security software may pick up that there's been an intrusion.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you can use at your home as well. Canary tokens are free. I've got them sprayed all over my file server, right? One of them is called passwords.pdf. But if anyone touches it, I get notified. Someone had a question here, Adam, and I don't know the answer. Have you ever seen an attack via Outlook or email that has compromised iOS devices?
I have not personally, no.
Yeah, I don't think I've read about any. Okay.
Other than the, what was the big, I think Pegasus or there's another name for it. There's the big iOS 0 day that nation state governments tend to use, but that can be as scary as a no-click 0 day from an iMessage itself. So, in theory, they could probably use Outlook to deliver that. But generally those iOS 0 days when they're discovered, they're either sold for a lot of money um, to like the 0-day initiative. They're reported to Apple to get a bug bounty back, so they get paid for it. Or if they're sold maliciously to some sort of darknet market, they may be purchased by a nation state government or someone with a lot of money to throw around. And I would like to think that none of our customers are targets of a nation state government as much as some others, but you never know with those kind of 0 days. But yeah, I haven't heard anything specific about any sort of Outlook related iOS exploit.
Okay. So just one topic we wanted to touch on, because I still think we have a lot of customers that are a little blurry on the difference between a traditional antivirus and what an EDR attempts to do, is just the notion of behaviors versus signatures. We've mentioned multiple times that when Adam does his pen testing, he will use open source tools, the same tools that bad actors use. So you would think it would be easy to detect those. But typically that's uncompiled code, and Adam and a bad actor doesn't have much of a problem obfuscating that code or recompiling it in a way that it no longer generates a signature that is alerting. So what an effective EDR program does is it monitors for behaviors that would be an indicator of compromise. And we've shown this before, you've probably seen it lots of places, but there are multiple attack frameworks that attempt to map out those TTPs, the tactics, techniques, and procedures. The MITRE attack framework, I think right now it outlines 14 tactics and 188 techniques, but an effective EDR program will either have a separate antivirus program or leave that traditional virus scanning signature detection to another product, and it will look for TTPs that show an indicator of compromise, right? And Adam, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but this is one reason why we think one of the biggest ways to make a splash in your security posture is to have something at the endpoint that is adhering to an attack framework and alerting you and mitigating threats in this fashion.
Yeah, and the challenge with MITRE, and you will see this in every security products marketing, every EDR vendor, they're going to say they have 100% MITRE coverage, which means on a perfect day in a perfect world, they can detect and map 100% of MITRE's behaviors to behaviors on the endpoint. So MITRE is important for building a foundation to understand behavior, but just having a product that tags behavior to these MITRE tags, it's causing a lot of noise. So you may have to have some help or some education to understand that just because I got an alert where I detected 5 of these MITRE techniques, how do I know this isn't a false positive? Understanding what order the techniques were performed in is very important to determining if the actual underlying behavior is malicious or not. So mapping things to MITRE is important, but it's really just a reference for somebody later looking at these detected map techniques to determine if it's malicious or not. And that's what a lot of SMBs struggle with. If you don't have a dedicated SOC or dedicated security team to look through these detections and actually understand what's going on, you can run into some challenges that way. And that's kind of where MDR comes into play to offload a lot of that analysis. But there's a lot of MITRE attack techniques that aren't inherently malicious by themselves. So it's understanding if it's a false positive or not at the end of the day.
And really sophisticated organizations will use suites of products and do their own attack framework mapping, but that is very time consuming. But you can read lots of articles about that.